Hello, my name is Charlotte Lauder. I am a PhD student at the University of Strathclyde and the National Library of Scotland. And today I'm going to be talking about the Scots Thistle, which was a circulatory manuscript magazine that began in 1885 and was active as recently as 2013. This magazine forms a small part of my PhD thesis, which looks at Scottish magazine culture, specifically literary magazines between 1870 and 1920, which can be briefly, although rather archaically, laid out in this concise timeline, which shows some of the most well-known moments in the history of modern Scottish magazines. Obviously, there are magazines that lie out with these historical moments, such as religious magazines, women's magazines, nationalist magazines, and others. And the magazine that I am talking about today, the Scots Thistle, has origins which fit broadly into these categories of, or these types of magazines, most notably children's magazines and literary society magazines. That being said, the Scots Thistle is a very unique publication, not just because of its longevity, but because it transcends the boundaries of different types of magazines, as well as national boundaries, to exist as a virtual literary society and a cultural artifact of Scottish national identity in modern magazine culture. So where did this magazine come from? Well, the magazine, the Scots Thistle, was created in 1885, but was originally titled the Scotch Thistle. And you can see the difference in the titles between the hand-painted cover for November 1903, which is on the left, and the cover for March 1911 on the right. The magazine circulated privately each month amongst members across the UK from 1885 until 2013, and it travelled through the post with members paying for postage as part of their membership to the magazine. And here are some more covers from 1923 and 1952. There were quite rigid rules for the magazine. For example, members had to submit at least one contribution per month. Contributions were limited to the following categories: prose, poetry, photography, and painting, and yearly and half-yearly subscriptions were due every May and November. My research today is based on a good but incomplete run of the Scots Thistle, which is held in the National Library of Scotland and covers the years 1903 to 2013. But there are major gaps within this collection. For example, there are no copies between 1911 to 1935, and 1968 to 1984, and 1985 to 1992. And the earliest issue in the collection is from 1903, which is 18 years after the first issue. The magazine was created by two childhood friends, Anne Wiley, later Anne Robertson, and Euphemia Martin, later Euphemia Patterson, in Kilmarnock in 1885. According to later issues of the magazine, Anne and Euphemia, who were 17 and 20 years old at the time, were visited by a friend from Cornwall in May 1885. And this friend in Kilmarnock received a manuscript magazine that she was already involved with in Cornwall called the Hillside Magazine, and this is said to have inspired Anne and Euphemia to do a similar thing. The magazine was then created with three other girls in Kilmarnock, a Miss McAllister, Miss Laurie, and Miss Smiley, as well as another friend in Cardiff, Miss Kennedy. Without first names for these other girls, it's hard to trace who they were, but based on census data and valuation rolls for Kilmarnock, I've narrowed down to who they might be, but these are tentative matches. At first, the magazine circulated amongst just these 6 girls between at least these addresses in Kilmarnock. The girls lived in the centre of Kilmarnock and were from middle-class families. Their fathers' occupations included a grocer, a merchant, a clerk, and a railway inspector. And although there are no copies of the 1885 magazine in the National Library of Scotland, the issue was described in a later edition of the magazine as having produced 8 contributions, including an article on Mary Shelley, a translation of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a short story, and 2 poems. And the magazine was jointly edited by Anne and Euphemia. Manuscript magazines that were produced by children and which circulated amongst them, particularly young girls, has been the subject of research by Catherine Gleadle and Lois Burke, to name just two. And here on the screen are two examples of manuscript magazines created by Scottish girls, Caberfae and the Pierrot. There are many other examples of these magazines in the collection of the Museum of Childhood in Edinburgh, which Lois Burke's upcoming monograph will go into much more detail about. These magazines have several characteristics, such as contributors' use of pseudonyms, a list of contributors' addresses to indicate where to send the magazine to, and page breaks for criticism of the magazine's content by its membership. These characteristics are also shared by manuscript magazines created in men's mutual improvement societies and literary associations, which Lauren Weiss has published on and which you can read more about in the latest issue of Victorian Periodicals Review and at the RSVP and SCVS sponsored website Literary Bonds, where Lauren has also made available digitally an Edinburgh-based men's manuscript magazine, the St. Stephen's Society magazine. The Scots Thistle has all of these characteristics. Here on the screen, you can see the contents page for 1903, as well as some of the pseudonyms that people published under, such as Cinderella, Sphinx, Fitzjames. And you can see that there are sections devoted to criticism at the end of the magazine. On the right, there is the circulation list with the addresses of the members. And here is a votes page, which was used by members to vote for their 4 favourite contributions per monthly issue. And those with the most votes received prizes that ranged from money for poetry books or painting supplies or photography equipment. Work on men's manuscript magazines by the Piston Pen and Press team has highlighted the emphasis on self-improvement and education in these magazines, which makes them distinct from other manuscript magazines and have shown how prevalent manuscript magazine production was in Scotland between the 1860s and the 1920s, particularly amongst mutual improvement societies that were attached to Presbyterian churches. And this story is true for the development of the Scots Thistle. In a reflective essay in 1935, one member of the Scots Thistle explained that she was the editor of another manuscript magazine titled The Echo, which was the magazine of the St. Bryce-Dale Literary Society in Kirkcaldy, which was attached to St. Bryce Kirk. She was then encouraged to join the Scots Thistle by a friend who was a member, and after conducting more research, I found that at least 3 other members of the Echo jumped ship, so to speak, to the Scots Thistle between roughly 1889 and 1905. It's difficult to summarise the content of the Scots Thistle across such a vast lifespan because it is so diverse, which is typical for a manuscript magazine or an amateur magazine. Contents range from travel essays in Europe to photographs of Scottish landscapes to short stories about the neighbourhoods of Edinburgh and the poetry of T.E. Lawrence. The most obvious theme running through each issue is what Juliet Shields has recently identified amongst Scottish women writers of the long 19th century, called The Romance of Everyday Life, which Juliet defines as a celebration of the ordinary aspects of Scottish life, including celebration of Scots language, vernacular dialects, ruralism, and white middle-class evangelical cosmopolitanism. And that particularly can be found in the Scots Thistle, which contains a lot of everyday content, such as photography of the Scottish countryside, paintings of members' children, poetry written in Scots, and essays about domestic life. Crucial to the magazine's celebration of everyday life was Scottish national identity. Firstly, the Scots Thistle is an obviously Scottish title, but the thistle, the plant, came to represent the membership. Members were collectively known as Thistleites, younger members were referred to as jags or spikes, and older members or members with a longer membership were known as leaves and branches. And this metaphor became a very extended metaphor. Leo, which was the pseudonym of Annie MacDonald Clark, referred to herself as, quote, a prickle on the splendid Scots Thistle, end quote, and described how new members became attached to, quote, the leaves by the blossoms and prickles alike of the growing plant, end quote. In addition, the spiky nature of the thistle was described as a desired trait of Thistleites, particularly in reference to the magazine's much-loved criticisms page. Lavengro, which was the pseudonym of Anna Pagan, noted that a prickly nature and "whadar meddle with me" attitude are inherent to a thistle, end quote. In this way, the thistle, the national emblem of Scotland, became the thing that imagined this community almost more than the magazine itself, which is a sort of role reversal if we are to use and follow Benedict Anderson's theory of imagined nations in this scenario. And this is an image here of 3 members of the Scots Thistle magazine who on holiday found a bunch of thistles and decided to pose with them. Indeed, to thistle became a verb that defined the process of contributing to the magazine. In 1945, Wendy, the pseudonym of Kate Bone, who was a very long-serving member and served as editor of the magazine, wrote an imaginary interview with herself in which she explained why she was a member of the magazine and what she got out of it. She asked herself, the interviewer asks Wendy, why do you thistle? If I may coin a new verb, for thistling seems to be a special sort of writing, not for oneself and not for the public. It is done hastily at the last minute with only the thistle in view. And Wendy replies, thistling, as you call it, doesn't need to be a special sort of writing. Why should it? Some of the members who have never wanted to sell their work find the thistle attractive because they can write without thinking of the markets. But they write primarily because they have an itch to write. And like all other itches, it is better to come out. The thistle stimulates one to write something, even though it may be done under pressure. One gets some sort of opinion about it, and having tried it out on the thistle, one may try it out on the press, either because of the thistle criticism or in spite of them. Although, despite its inherent Scottishness, geographically, the magazine was not bound to Scotland. Here is a map indicating the geographical spread of the magazine. Red pins are addresses identified as early as 1903. Orange diamonds indicate addresses between 1907 and 1968, and the blue circles are 1985 and beyond. By taking a closer look, apologies for the blurriness of that map, most members lived in the central belt of Scotland, particularly in Fife, which is where a substantial number of members lived as recently as 2013. Although the Scots Thistle was very much a middle-class pastime, members enjoyed the simple act of contributing to the magazine, receiving criticism, and the anonymity that the pseudonyms provided. And the magazine has a discreet but significant impact in the life of Scottish literature in the 20th century, and this is where I'm going to end my discussion. Some well-known and very well-regarded modern Scottish poets have been members of the Scots Thistle, including William Soutar, who wrote in the magazine as Scribblerus, and Robert Garriock, whose pseudonym was Gromit. Soutar was a poet associated with the first wave of the Scottish Renaissance in the 1920s, who wrote in Scots and English, although it's unclear to me how he joined the magazine or what he published in it, because no copies of the magazine from his time of membership, which I've been told roughly is between 1927 and 1931, survive. That being said, his poem, The Three Puddocks, was reprinted in a special issue of the magazine in 1942, which does suggest to me that it may have been published in the magazine at some point, because a primary aim of the Scots Thistle magazine was to publish original content. Robert Garriock was an important figure in the post-Second World War Scottish literary scene and a member of the Scots Thistle from at least 1963 to 1968, but it is possible that he was a member earlier and later than these dates. His membership coincided with the creation of some of his best known and most loved poems, and because Garriock only published poetry in book form in 1966 and 1977, it's very likely that some of his poems were originally published or originally given to the membership of the Scots Thistle, and that the members of this amateur magazine may have been the first to ever see, perhaps without knowing that Garriock was behind the name Grommet, these poems. I am spending time with people who are much more acquainted with Robert Garriock's work to try and ascertain that claim, but it is looking very, very likely to me that some of his best known poems, including Sisyphus and Elegy, were first published in the Scots Thistle, among others on the screen here. In addition, it looks like that there's some unpublished material by Garriock in the Scots Thistle, including this on the screen. Finally, Garriock's pseudonym in the Scots Thistle, Grommet, is a name that appears fairly frequently in Scottish literary magazines of the 1960s and 1970s, which Garriock was associated with either as an editor or as a more common contributor under his own name, Robert Garriock. I have spent some time also trying to ascertain whether or not articles and reviews that were published under the name Andrew Grommet are potentially Robert Garriock using a sort of variation of the Grommet pseudonym, particularly in Scottish International and Lines Review. Okay, so to conclude, the Scots Thistle is a unique source in any discussion about Scottish manuscript magazines because it was not a society or association in the traditional sense. There are no minute books or records of the membership that constitute the magazine as a society beyond the rules. And it was not until the 1960s that the members produced a financial report or statistical account of the magazine. Further, members did not meet in person. Sometimes, in fact, they never met at all, and often they did not know the real identities of the pseudonyms. Further, members did not share their articles before the assembly of the magazine by the editor each month. And unlike a Mutual Improvement Society magazine, which was often the product of the society or the meeting of the society, the Scots Thistle represents both the product and the people simultaneously. In this way, the Scots Thistle was a virtual literary society that existed outside of the traditional temporal and spatial boundaries of an in-person literary society meeting or group. The magazine is therefore unique precisely because it is a multi-personal, transnational, imagined community without the spatiality that is traditionally associated with a magazine or a mutual improvement society, such as an office or printing department, or the spatiality of a literary society, such as a church hall, a library, a pub, or a reading room. So by taking a longer view of Scottish magazine culture from roughly 1870 to 1970, throughout its lifetime, the Scots Thistle has reflected the different types of Scottish magazine culture and the significant moments in Scottish magazine production, from men's mutual improvement magazines to children's circulatory magazines, little magazines of the Scottish Renaissance, and then the thriving literary magazines of the post-war period in Scotland. Thank you very much.